Oh, we got a lot of, I got a little bit of a nerdier presentation than normal in terms of getting into some specificities around a concept. A lot of this is a bit of a provocation. You'll see that some of this is a bit self-centered. In terms of really getting into what is green extractivism and kind of pulling this term apart, what it is, where it came from. And so, yeah, we'll be looking at a quick genealogy, look at the different definitions, relate it to green grabbing, and look at new research frontiers and general conclusions. But I don't have much time, and I really want to kind of stick to this to allow for questions and answers. So let's get into this. So ultimately, mines and plantations are the foundation of really looking at green extractivism. And this comes out of course, in Latin America with the extractivismo literature, or extractivism is kind of the foundation for this. And so we'll get into some of the kind of the basic definitions of that in a moment. But what really foregrounds this idea of green extractivism, of course, comes from extractivism literature. And specifically in 2009 in Spanish, 2010 in English, with Godinez, and there might be some earlier stuff before this, but this is what I could find, is when they write, meanwhile, extractivism for export advances as much in classic production provided by mining and petroleum, like Anya explained to us earlier, as in new types of agriculture and forestry. So here we're seeing the door again opened by Godinez to look into the so-called more green kind of, or bio industries, and how this might relate to extractivism. And so then we see the kind of the rise of kind of agricultural extractivism and agricultural neo-extractivism that Godinez was talking about. And so this is going to relate to scale, intensities, chemicals, pesticides, and agriculture. So there's entire industries behind them, and we're going to talk about that later. And we see this kind of again coming up with Alberto Acosta, where he says extractivism is not limited to minerals or oil. Extractivism is also present in farming, forestry, and even fishing. So here we're seeing extractivism really open this up to look at these green industries some more. And a crucial point from Acosta is really this aspect of renewability. And this is what's going to be a big issue behind how things get painted green. And I think this is really important, and what goes behind this, at the renewability issue, and that's the scale and intensity of extraction. Many so-called renewable resources, such as forestry or soil fertility, are becoming non-renewable. So this means that there is renewability, but it's being pressed, it's being exhausted. And this is another key aspect behind extractivism. And this, if anything, this understanding of renewability actually presses to how this green label is rather maybe redundant or inappropriate, in terms of this renewability, or so-called green, is actually being kind of destroyed through this kind of hyper exploitation. But importantly, this opened the field of extractivism to agro and forestry extractivism, from, really led by also Marcus Kroger, who is at the University of Helsinki and part of the Exalt Initiative. Great work. Henry Veltimir, Yolanda, who looked at some of these things earlier, Ben McKay, Alberto, and many more. But this really opened up this kind of the agro extractivism kind of door, which is a really strong precursor and foundation to this concept of green extractivism. But looking at extractivism, let's really look at some of the key features. So Godinez stresses, and there's been debates about this, Exalt has hosted this and has done a lot to kind of bring out and really revive the extractivism debates, is that you've got roughly 4 traditional features. You have significant volumes of raw material export with no to limited processing in the host country. So this really just kind of plundering natural resources and pulling them out. 2, you have value chain concentration and sectoral disarticulation. So this move towards actually concentrating capital, concentrating industries, de-articulating kind of public or even private industries from those nations, and moving these towards monopoly concentration. 3, height intensity of environmental degradation. So you are destroying environments, and deterioration of labor opportunities and conditions. And so this means this kind of is a nod to kind of roll back neoliberalism in terms of just gutting social nets and protections and labor laws. And this is kind of grown, and these are a bit established already. A lot of extractivism in itself is an ideology related to capital and the power of accumulation and economic growth. But this kind of gets to kind of modernism, and also just kind of the even Eurocentrism, and based in kind of some of these concepts in terms of how it's being imposed, and obviously relates to colonialism and neocolonialism. And then 6, self-reinforcing practices and mentalities. And so this means that you're really kind of creating a culture of taking, of grabbing, of extracting. And so this really stresses that there's no to little socio-ecological reciprocity with people in these countries. So this is largely well established, but now the concept's been getting opened up. And, you know, again, since we're with kind of Exalt here, a great piece is the special form on extractivisms and global extractivisms, but their piece from extractivism to global extractivisms, the evolution of an organizing concept, is a great piece that came out that really gives a great review. But we're seeing kind of additional expansions into the epistemology and ontology. So ultimately how people's ways that their science, the ways that they relate to the world and understand it and see it, and how that in itself is becoming commodified, used and abused and extracted. We're also looking at the way that, you know, literal data mining and the process of data mining, which is a metaphor, and then also the physical mining that goes into the data that we have. For example, how much energy we're even using and that requires for using Zoom, or the different Bitcoins or cryptocurrencies and all these things and how they relate, and also just general financial transactions and how this relates to an extract energy and also material extractive process, but also as extracting data from people. And yeah, Sophia could say a lot of nice things about this, but multidimensional supply chains that enables extractivism. So I think one of the big issues in this debate, and one that I've personally stressed, is that behind even what we're calling extractivism, so let's say just the mining for even traditional sectors like hydrocarbon or mineral, you actually need an entire supply chain of the different machinery and things behind this. And so, for example, an issue I raised in relation to these kind of debates is that agrarian extractivism relies on a whole system of extractivism behind it, not only for pesticides in terms of how you even produce these, the different kind of extraction of different materials, the manufacturing of chemicals, the guys in white coats and R&D. Same goes for fertilizers. And then there was always the famous kind of conversation about how fertilizers became popular after World War I because they had to do something with the nitrocellulose that they used to use in bombs. Huge genetically modified organisms, and the research and development that goes into this is the amount of work and the supply chains, the fact that the factories, the labs, and everything that go into this. You know, there's an enormous amount of energy and material that goes into this. And now the digital apps that are now monitoring plant cycles and facilitating different monocrop or kind of plant development. So behind a lot of this is to really stress that there is such an extensive web of actually extractivism that even can make things like agrarian extractivism possible. So really, and this also relates to kind of nature commodification and certification products, you know, military and police supply webs, which relates to the book that Andrea Brock and I have co-edited, really looking at the police and military and security forces as kind of key drivers in ecological and climatic catastrophe. But to remember, like my chapter really stresses, is that behind all the repression for mines and even kind of urban uprisings, you have an extractive supply web behind this. But getting into this, where did green extractivism come from? And so this is maybe one of the first provocative points in terms of saying, to my knowledge, Andrea Brock and I kind of use this term as a way to kind of just generally speak about not only wind turbine development, but also the way of all the different green offsets from the Hambach coal mine that she'll be talking about later today. But so the first definition that we were working with in 2017 was green extractivism or green mining is this central to the reconciliation of industrial destruction with socio and ecological sustainability in the form of green economy. So we're really equating green extractivism just with mining for so-called kind of green ends, or using that label to brand coal mining, for example, as green or responsible. And then again, in my book, I looked at green extractivism as kind of wind turbines or anything branded as green, creating continuity between conventional and green extractive activities from coal mining to wind turbines. And this is just to say that, you know, you're grabbing land, you're actually engaged in an extractive process, which my whole kind of PhD research was about, and the book Renewing Destruction. So, but then things pick up. The term is kind of gaining steam. You know, someone who looks at this is Rio Francos. She wrote a piece here, and I think Logic, we are in Nature. I can't remember the name of the journal, but it's kind of a short, kind of popular piece. And green extractivism, the subordination of human rights and ecosystems to endless extraction in the name of solving climate change. So there's kind of a nice kind of angle in a similar direction. Vask Boyko Bojnik and Andarucci, sorry for butchering it. Their kind of recent piece in Environment and Planning E look at green extractivism presents a new phase in the complex relationships between mining and the environment, whereby extraction and the valorization of mineral resources is rendered not only compatible with sustainable development, but necessary to it and the possibility of a low carbon future. So we're having similar themes here. And Bruna, who most recently looks at kind of green extractivism as a variation of extractivism that feeds capital accumulation through appropriation of nature, mediated through differential levels of labor exploitation and through asymmetric and exploitative social, economic, and ecological relations. So here's kind of what we've had, or at least what I could find, in terms of kind of more distinct definitions in terms of how it's used. Oh yeah, and there's that. But one of the key issues is how does green extractivism actually distinguish itself from green grabbing? And so green grabbing is also kind of, here's the definition from the Fairhead et al. Piece that's highly cited and famous. Green grabbing, the appropriation of land and resources for environmental ends, is an emerging process of deep and growing significance. Appropriation implies the transfer of ownership, use rights, and control over resources that were once publicly or privately owned, or not even the subject of ownership, from the poor, or everyone including the poor, into the hands of the powerful. So we're seeing a little bit of overlap there. But a lot of this is about land control or green control grabs in terms of actually demarcating space. And this comes from 2008, and Fairhead, Leach, and Schoons were big at bringing it about. And this concept has been applied rather broadly in terms of conservation. We're seeing this in terms of the fortress conservation conversation, community-based conservation, market-based, or market influenced, even though it's because it's private sector or public sector financed, ecotourism, and also marine conservation. So we're seeing green grabbing used widely. Two, in monocultures, we're seeing in agriculture and forestry, and then also in low carbon infrastructures. We're seeing it in dam, wind, solar, and biomass, of course, and then tidal wave is kind of as an actual question mark. So what is the real difference between these things? So both are appropriation. As Gudina showed us, extractivism is a style of development based on appropriation of nature. And so what I put forward to you today, and the best way for me to make sense of this, is to really think about act versus modality or structure. So there's kind of, maybe we can look at green grabbing and green extractivism as two kind of modalities. So grabbing, we can think of it being the act of conquest, meaning that this is the planning and the grabbing, the seizure, taking, transfer, and converting of kind of land for these projects. And so there's obviously a long time of finance and mobilizing finance and organizing what would be enclosures and different commodifications. But for example, REDD+, despite it being propped up, we have a lot of failed examples. We have some variegated successes, so-called successes, and things like this. But you can see that sometimes with green grabbing, the project won't actually kind of create what I would say is important for extractivism, and that is a structure of conquest. So really thinking of Patrick Wolf is that there's kind of a modality, there's a structure. So there's a systemic, there's an intensive and continuous self-sustaining kind of taking, a self-sustaining and kind of repetitive killing and kind of maintaining in those areas to kind of degrade. And so this relates to really how you're actually enclosing nature and actually successfully commodifying it, successfully integrating into the economy and different financial mechanisms that the neoliberal natures, and especially Sean Sullivan, Brahm, and all of them have been well at actually showing. And Bruna, she's taken this up a bit. She kind of looks at the difference between process of resource grabbing as a driver of dispossession and hidden accumulation agendas. The concept of green extractivism allows us to explore asymmetric exchange relations, including ecological relations between actors, regions that feed accumulation. So there's still a lot of overlap you can kind of see between some of that. But this also raises some issues, or at least first, there's a very clear connection between macro, micro, and kind of financial systems in terms of maintaining a structure. But green extractivism, there's also kind of thinking to Tanya Marie Lee, green extractivism does not require labor. So another kind of similar thing is the famous quote, when the land is needed, but the labor is not, the most likely outcome is expulsion of people from the land. But so this applies to both of them. You can also integrate people. You always need to integrate some level of people to kind of manage a lot of these projects in the area to some degree, even though it's usually a much less number than who actually live there. But then another kind of issue is the mechanisms to comply with international regulations. Green extractivism and green grabbing are ultimately kind of rollout projects of the green economy and really trying to encourage making new kind of green finance and different projects that are ultimately maintaining capitalism, but still engaging in various processes of extractivism or less extractivism that is being done more frequently. But kind of the bigger question is the definition above is really kind of, you know, where's ecological distribution conflicts fit in here, because they're all about actually looking at different, the unequal benefits and costs of these different projects. So there's asymmetrical exchange relations also with ecological distribution conflicts, which is something also to think about. But overall, green extractivism, I would say, encompasses green grabbing, the land acquisition process, but further, but further, okay, I can't see things. But further indicates the various quantitative sectoral expansions and qualitative intensifications of political control, nature, commodification, marketization, and kinetic or vital energy extraction. So this is kind of the definition that I'd put forward. And this relates to ultimately what Judith and I did in kind of a larger piece when we're looking at the social engineering extraction, is really looking at, as really trying to analytically develop the concept of green extractivism. And so we look at the kind of the direct and indirect green extractivism. And so this is to be analytically useful to talk about the different levels and ways that green extractivism can kind of take place. And so we talk about there's indirect green extractivism, which invisibilizes, and it's indirect because it's a stress that, I've dealt with for, 6 or 7 years now. Everyone just really uncritically being like, yeah, energy transition, low carbon infrastructures, wind, solar, blah, blah, blah. This is so green and friendly. But if you look at it, these are clearly, some of them are giant robots, and they're very serious kind of mechanical and industrial features, which means there's going to be a serious kind of energy and material cost behind them. So the indirect aspect is to really stress that there's actually an entire supply chain behind a lot of the things that are branded as green, clean, environmentally friendly, and sometimes, and wrongly, renewable. But so indirect green extractivism gets into the different mining, cobalt, lead, rare earth minerals, different iron ore, hydrocarbon production, plastic, concrete, you name it, the different storage facilities. There's an immense amount of stuff going into this. And I've done way too many articles about this stuff. But then there's also conservation and ecotourism equipment supply chain. So even when we're talking, and so this relates to what I was saying about agro extractivism, is that even behind conservation ecotourism, there's a necessary requirement for the fences, the machines, the GPS, and not to mention the securitization that goes into some of these things. And this relates to other kind of digitalization, automation of mining and manufacturing, and also just the kind of economic and financial markets related to the capital accumulation behind them. So there's a lot to go there, and really think, what am I forgetting? There's so much behind this and so much to unpack. And two, so green extractivism, direct green extractivism, this is something that I felt has been very underestimated. And that's really looking at extraction from the sites themselves. So I work a lot in kind of low carbon infrastructures, specifically wind energy. But so this is really looking at the direct extraction from low carbon infrastructures, the measuring, commodifying of nature or more than human nature with different kind of meteorology or epistemology, quantitative kind of science. You have conservation ecotourism schemes in terms of not only how they're kind of controlling it, commodifying it, but also how they're trying to marketize it. So this applies. International conferences. So not only this rolling out of these new industries, you've got new bureaucracies to talk about how the world's burning and how's it going to do and how they're going to divvy up the spoils to create green capitalism. So there's a rolling out of new bureaucracies. And again, a big issue that's underestimated is actually the characteristics of indirect or direct green extractivism is the new and intensifying commodifications, really measuring wind flows, trying to commodify them, and really try to harness as much kinetic energy extraction as possible, or non-human life in general, as related to the neoliberal nature's literature that has done so well at this. But for example, behind wind turbines, how there's a wind velocity deficit of 18 to 23 kilometers downwind. that is actually creating different climatic and weather changes in areas of high concentrations of wind turbines, which also relates to weather modification, biological impacts on species and adaptations and die-off, and also with when you apply these things in the ocean, you know, how is this affecting ocean vitality and things like this. Yeah, so similar to geological mapping of any ore body, wind and solar resources need to be mapped to ascertain their potential quality and yield. So again, we're seeing this rapid expansion of commodification and systemic extraction. And this is from someone who's looking at helping mining companies kind of adapt and decarbonize their industries. So yeah, there's new frontiers of extractivism and socio-biological ecological repercussions. You know, what are the impacts of this? But to try to keep this on time, keep it moving. But so there's new frontiers. There's a need to kind of research a lot of these things. So on a theoretical level, there's developing theoretical relationships between green extractivism, green grabbing, ecological distribution conflicts. Again, really looking at conservation supply chains to say that not only are these enclosures and this control of land are extractive, but there's an entire apparatus behind this of energy and material use and ultimately ecological degradation, if not destruction. This also means exploring solar and other forms of direct and kinetic energy extraction. You know, what are the impacts of actually blocking solar from going into the ground? What are the impacts of actually kind of altering this and moving wind streams? How is it going to affect seasons? How is this regenerating itself? How is it altering it? And this also means, as with the latest book coming out, that's really trying to make a start of this, is highlighting police military supply chains related to everything they do, but also green projects, so-called green projects. Intersections of sustainable violence, which is a term I defined to talk about the way police and militaries are actually integrating wind, solar, and different kind of low carbon infrastructures to say that they are greening the military, and green extractive projects. So really looking at how the military and security forces are doubling down on this and working with these, you know, sustainable mining or decarbonizing the mine projects as they're called by industry. There's also, like with the new bureaucracies, there's new consultancy firms that are really working with hydrocarbon and mining industries to decarbonize them. So there's an entire new skill set and kind of corporate ethnography that can take place and to really examine these things and further explore and dissect the epistemologies promoting green extractivism. This is to really stress confronting the kind of corporate science and the blind spots and the reductions that are allowing this kind of green label or renewability or clean label that really needs to be debunked systematically and by more scientists and people across the board. And then finally, really looking at the financial constructions and infrastructural green financial extraction and how that works. So trying to stick to time, only a minute or so over. The conclusion here is to really stress that in general, green extractivism is fictitious. It is a new intensification or expansion of enclosure, commodification, and extractivism on air, water, trees, plants, and people, which is to really stress that it's just extractivism, you know, and it's just we're using the green to talk about different kind of life forms that are being kind of extracted. Yeah, the green represents finance, capital, fake or questionable claims to regeneration, which are being overexploited and risk exhaustion. Green labeling is ultimately manipulation, marketing, and based on hyper extracted claims and epistemology. So this means we really got to debunk this stuff in terms of how is it actually renewable, and really the science, you know, whether it's whether it's just kind of quantitative modeling or a medical science, you know, there is things that are being lost and qualities in terms of how we live and relate to our environments and even our own bodies that are kind of being erased or accepted in terms of how kind of industrial capitalism or computational capitalism is developing itself. Green extractivism is a useful analytical container to identify claims of renewability, but in the end, it is just extractivism, not green, like I said. And this is to stress a point that I maybe is not so clear in here because I say it in so many other talks and things like this, is that all of these industries are radically connected. Conventional, green, or what they're either, if they're not connected directly in financial holdings or different kind of diversifying different investments, then they are in supply chain management in terms of the resources that they're using, factories, and maybe even mines that they share for different resources, whether it's for smartphones or different digital technologies or for low carbon infrastructures. Not to mention the issue that things like smart and the use of different kind of smart technologies, which with serious social control issues, are somehow imagined as green and environmentally friendly. So with that, I will leave you with this cat who's gone green, who's sitting in a bag because he's green, and we can think of the cat of extraction companies and the bag as the environmental rhetoric used to kind of rebrand their decarbonization efforts.